Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has approved a measure that would give Congress a say in the final nuclear deal with Iran. The bill was passed by unanimous vote after President Obama withdrew his opposition. The White House says the bill has sufficiently been modified to address its concerns, but the bill's sponsors say the administration backed down rather than face bipartisan opposition. The measure calls for a Senate review of a final nuclear deal and a potential congressional vote on lifting sanctions. If Congress votes to reject the Iran deal, the Senate would need a 67-vote majority to overturn a veto from President Obama. Senator Bob Corker outlined the terms.
Congress stays involved if an agreement is reached. And if one is not disapproved, Congress stays involved, and every 90 days, the administration has to certify that in every way Iran is in compliance. And if there are violations within a 10-day period, they have to give that to Congress so that we have the ability, if we wish, to quickly reapply the sanctions that, if a deal is approved, would be alleviated.
The full Senate is expected to approve the measure when it takes it up later this month. If Obama cannot override a veto of a measure rejecting the deal, he could become the only leader involved unable to fully honor the pledges made. President Obama has told Congress he will remove Cuba from a U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism, clearing a main obstacle to restoring diplomatic relations with Havana for the first time in half a century. Obama's move came just days after he and Cuban President Raul Castro sat down at a summit in Panama for the first meeting of its kind in half a century. Cuba was placed on the terrorism list in 1982 at a time when Havana was supporting liberation struggles in Africa and Latin America. Once Cuba's officially removed from the list in 45 days, Iran, Sudan, and Syria will be the only countries remaining. We'll have more on this story after headlines will go to Havana, Cuba. The UN Security Council has passed a resolution imposing an arms embargo on Houthi rebels in Yemen. U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power said the measure targets those stoking Yemen's violence.
The United States strongly supports the adoption of today's resolution, which imposes consequences on the Houthi and former President Saleh, demands that the Houthi cease military operations, and calls on all sides to once again return to the negotiating table. The imposition of a global asset freeze and travel ban on Ahmed Ali Saleh and Abdul Malik al-Houthi, as well as a targeted arms embargo, shows that this Council will take action against those who continue to undermine efforts toward reconciliation.
Several Yemen analysts say the measure could intensify the siege of Yemen, which has choked off its economy and denied vital supplies to a country in crisis. The measure adopts no restrictions on the military campaign led by Saudi Arabia and excludes an initial Russian proposal for a humanitarian pause in the Saudi-led strikes. According to UN figures, at least 364 civilians have been killed and over 680 wounded since the Saudi strikes began 3 weeks ago. Both the strikes and Houthi rebel attacks have been blamed. On Tuesday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights warned both sides may have committed war crimes and urged Saudi Arabia to avoid bombing civilians and public infrastructure. The Saudi-led strikes have hit hospitals, schools, a refugee camp, and several neighborhoods. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. officials have privately voiced concerns to Saudi counterparts about civilian casualties and the operation's broader aims. But they've also increased support for the strikes in recent days, providing them with direct targeting support for sites the kingdom wants to bomb, unquote. In other news from Yemen, the group Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula says one of its senior leaders has died in a U.S. drone strike. Ibrahim al-Rubaish, a top Saudi figure in AQAP and a former Guantanamo Bay prisoner, was reportedly killed on Sunday. He had a $5 million bounty on his head. This comes as a new study by the Open Society Justice Foundation has found U.S. drone strikes have killed Yemeni civilians despite President Obama's vow to launch attacks only if there is near certainty no innocents will be harmed. Abdul Rashid al-Fahi, the report's co-author, said, quote, "In incident after incident, eyewitnesses told us of watching civilians being burned alive or losing parents, siblings, and children in U.S. drone strikes. Civilians wanted to know why they had been targeted when they were not affiliated with al-Qaeda. They wanted justice," he said. A coalition of 45 aid groups is appealing for global pressure to end the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip. The Association of International Development Agencies says reconstruction is barely underway on the thousands of homes destroyed in last summer's 6-week Israeli assault. Meanwhile, living conditions have only worsened as Israel continues the siege and foreign aid is at a trickle. Just 26% of $3.5 billion pledged at a donors' conference in October has arrived. The groups say that without open borders and a durable Israel-Hamas ceasefire, quote, a return to conflict and the cycles of damage and donor-funded reconstruction that accompany it is inevitable. An Egyptian court has confirmed the death sentences of 14 people, including Mohammed Badi, leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. Badi has been sentenced to death before, with those sentences later reduced to life imprisonment. The court also sentenced American citizen Mohammed Sultan to life in prison on charges of supporting the Brotherhood and transmitting false news. The defendants were tried for events surrounding the Rabaa massacre of August 2013, when Egyptian forces killed hundreds of protesters opposing a military coup. The verdicts will be appealed to Egypt's highest civilian court. They come just 2 weeks after the Obama administration lifted a freeze on military aid to the Egyptian regime. In a statement, the White House condemns Sultan's life sentence and demanded his immediate release. A 9-year-old girl is reportedly pregnant after being gang-raped in captivity by the militant group Islamic State in Iraq. The girl is one of over 200 Yazidi Christians released by ISIS last week. She's been flown to Germany for medical treatment. Aid workers say she is so young she could die if she delivers the baby. Hillary Rodham Clinton has kicked off her bid for the Democratic presidential nomination with her first formal campaigning in Iowa. Outlining her agenda, Clinton told supporters she supports a constitutional amendment to get unaccountable money out of politics.
We need to build the economy of tomorrow, not yesterday. We need to strengthen families and communities because that's where it all starts. We need to fix our dysfunctional political system and get unaccountable money out of it once and for all, even if that takes a constitutional amendment. And we need to protect our country from the threats that we see and the ones that are on the horizon. So I'm here in Iowa to begin a conversation about how we do that.
2 college students have been charged with sexual assault that Florida police say was witnessed in broad daylight, but that no one tried to stop. Cell phone video shows the suspects surrounding an incapacitated woman on a crowded beach filled with college students on their spring break. Police say the victim was then gang raped while a large crowd stood around. A third suspect is being sought. The woman says she believes she was drugged and doesn't remember the incident. Former educators in Atlanta, Georgia, have been given prison sentences of up to 7 years for their roles in a massive cheating scandal at public schools. Prosecutors say teachers were forced to modify incorrect answers, and students were even allowed to fix their responses during exams. 21 other defendants avoided trial with plea deals, but the 9 sentenced to jail rejected sentencing agreements so they can appeal. It's said to be one of the largest school cheating scandals in U.S. history. Donald Bullock, an educator who reached a plea deal, apologized for his role.
I, Donald Bullock, do hereby sincerely apologize to the students, my fellow staff members, parents, and the Atlanta public school system, as well as the greater metropolitan Atlanta community, for my involvement in the 2009 CRC administration resulted in cheating or other dysfunctional acts.
The case has fueled new scrutiny of the education system's reliance on standardized testing, which critics say incentivizes cheating. According to the New York Times, quote, cheating has grown at school districts around the country as standardized testing has become a primary means of evaluating teachers, principals, and schools, unquote. In a major show of opposition to standardized testing, tens of thousands of parents in New York State had their children boycott the annual English language arts exam. The action is seen as a major challenge to the education agenda of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and to standardized testing nationwide. You can find out more in Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez's latest column in the New York Daily News, which we've linked to at our website, democracynow.org. The head of the World Bank has endorsed calls for a carbon tax and an end to subsidies for fossil fuels. Speaking to The Guardian, Yong Kim said poor countries are feeling, quote, the boot of climate change on their neck, adding, quote, we need to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies now. This comes as students at Harvard University are holding Harvard Heat Week, a bid to pressure the school to divest from the fossil fuel industry. Actions are taking place, including an occupation of the Harvard Alumni Association and a blockade of administration buildings. Protests have been held from coast to coast in a day of action against police violence and racial profiling. In New York City, some 250 people with the Stop Mass Incarceration Network marched across the Brooklyn Bridge.
I just want to stop the police brutality against my Latinos and my black people, because 99% of the time the cops are in Bushwick, East New York, Harlem, everywhere committing violence against Spanish people, black people. Why we can't have this, you know? Because it's like, why they gotta abuse us?
Dozens of people were arrested as scuffles between demonstrators and police broke out and traffic was disrupted for several hours. Activists were also detained in Los Angeles after a large crowd blocked a metro track during Tuesday rush hour. The protests follow the recent police killings of unarmed African-Americans Walter Scott in South Carolina and Eric Harris in Oklahoma. Each incident was caught on video. We'll have more on that story later in the broadcast. And protests are being held across the country today in what organizers call the largest ever mobilization of underpaid workers. Fast food workers in 230 cities are walking off the job as part of the Fight for $15 campaign, a push for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Hundreds of workers in Boston held their action one day early in deference to today's anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings. In New York City, the day of protest kicked off this morning at a McDonald's in Brooklyn.
My name is Catherine Cruz. I work at McDonald's, and I'm here to fight for 15 for what we deserve. We've been working for $8.75, and it's not enough to live off of, and we work really hard to make $8.75 and not be able to live. I feel like we should all, not only McDonald's, not only fast food workers, everyone that lives off minimum wage should make more so we can all support our families, support ourselves.
Students will also walk out at more than 200 schools in what's being described as the biggest campus protest since the anti-apartheid movement. The students and fast food workers will be joined by low-wage employees from other fields and businesses, including home care, child care, airport, and Walmart. Organizers say the actions are being held on tax day to highlight the public assistance needed to support underpaid workers. A new study says low wages are forcing working families to rely on more than $150 billion in public assistance. According to the University of California Center for Labor Research and Education, more than half of combined state and federal spending on public assistance goes to working families. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Good.